Welcome to the Institute for Philosophy and Social Theory of the University of Belgrade. At present, as you see, only Gazela and I are here, and we are very sorry that we could not hold this conference entitled Engaged in Applied Philosophy, the Social Role of Contemporary Theory in person. As a coordinator of the International Scientific Board of this institute, which Joe Wolff co-chairs, and as a co-director of the Center of Advanced Studies of the University of Rijeka, where Joe sits on the advisory board, and as one of the organizers of this conference, along with Hana Samardžija and Marko Konjović, it is my great pleasure to greet you all, and Joe in particular, who is a friend and he's been frequent guest in Rijeka, Belgrade, and Dubrovnik. With Gazela's permission, I would like to be one to announce that Joe Wolff is this year's laureate of the Institute's Miladin Životić Award for Social Engagement. This award is given to those remarkable individuals who incessantly push the envelope, ever springing forward toward progress and change, driven by urgency of the moment, seeking to outpace the lurking forces of communal discord. Miladin Životić, born in 1930 and died in 1997, one of the founders of Institute for Philosophy and Social Theory and a key member of the Yugoslav Praxis philosophy, was also a specific type of Pheidippides, runner, not only courier or citizen athlete, he was also hemerodromos. That means a day-long runner whose skills surpassed competition into the realm of historical achievement. For it is said that Pheidippides died 1 hour after arriving at the gates of Athens, where he saluted citizens and announced their victory. Alas, it would appear that we will have to bestow Joe with this award somewhere else, probably next spring in London or Oxford. Last year, the award was given to Etienne Balibar at the American University in Paris. I would like to announce that we have begun the procedure for awarding an honorary doctorate of the University of Belgrade to Joe Wolff. You will recall that previous laureates of the Miladin Životić Award have also been given honorary doctorates. However, previous recipients of our award thematized engagement and action policy de facto when they were receiving the award, and when we asked them to do so, as the concept of engagement best covers the various activities of the Institute, Joe Wolff, by contrast, announced 5 years ago something he termed, I quote, constructive engagement. Namely, speaking of the 1953 film The Wild One, in which Marlon Brando plays Johnny, in a Guardian column, Joe insists that, I quote, academics must reply to the Marlon Brando crew, and that, I quote, both politics and academia will suffer unless we can create a new form of constructive engagement, end of quote. In one scene in the film, which is layered in meaning and complex, I urge you to watch it, we get the following dialogue. One person is Mildred and says, somebody tell me what that means, BRMC. What does that mean? Boxer says, Black Rebels Motorcycle Club. Then again, Mildred. Oh, that's cute. What are you rebelling against? Grabbing Johnny. What are you rebelling against, Johnny? Johnny gives her a quick, stony look and says, what have you got? Mildred then turns now laughing, sees Katie and says, hi, Katie. Aren't they wonderful? Did you hear what I said? I said what does that mean, BRMC? And he said, the Black Rebels, Motorcycle Club. And I said, what are you rebelling against, Johnny? Johnny said, what you have got. What you have got. Isn't that cute? When Joe says a new form of constructive engagement in response to Brando, who is actually insisting of a new project, it is opposite to a phrase Lenin ascribes to Napoleon and Michael Walzer in the introduction to his political action to some French revolutionary. In French, on s'engage et puis on voit, a phrase which can be described in English as one first jumps into the fray, then figures out what to do, or could be rendered as a leap before you look. 2 years later, still responding but also hitting Brando, Joe Wolff writes a text that has inspired us to put together this colloquium and which we have therefore placed at the core of this conference. Method in philosophy and public policy, applied philosophy versus engaged philosophy. I will now let Gazella introduce Joe Wolff, after which we will hear his lecture. Thank you.
Thank you, Petar. An interesting introduction, as always. I'm going to say a few words about Jonathan, and I want once more here to express my gratitude for accepting to give this keynote lecture at the conference, which is basically made into his honor, having in mind the theme of the conference, but also that is something which is very valuable and important topic for the Institute as a whole here in Belgrade. So Jonathan Wolff is, for the moment, Alfred Landecker Professor of Values in Public Policy at the University of Oxford. And before taking this position in last year, he was Blavatnik Professor of Public Policy also at the University of Oxford. Before that, he was Professor of Philosophy and Dean on Faculty of Arts and Humanities in University College London, where he graduated his studies of philosophy, mentored by Gerald Allen Cohen, one of the founders of September Group, and also one of the most important representatives of something which is called analytical Marxism. During his long academic career, Wolff has engaged into different topics in the field of political and moral philosophy. And one aspect of this engagement, which I would like to particularly emphasize here, is that in difference to other political philosophers and philosophers in general, that rely in their works at thought experiments and hypothetical scenarios, Wolff actually develops his vision of society of the equals, relying on experiences of those marginalized members of society, for example, persons with disabilities. And in one of his last books, together with Avner de Shalit, Disadvantage, which was published in 2007, he actually performed a lot of interviews with representatives of these groups in order to bring evidence into his claim what consists good life. I will not take many of your time. I would just like to emphasize that Jonathan Wolff is also personally very much engaged as a philosopher, and his engagement is seen mostly in membership in numerous organizations and councils in the United Kingdom, which are bringing the voice of the experts into public policy creation, which we consider very important also, because the role of philosophers is not so frequently seen in these bodies. So he was the member of Nuffield Council, working party on research involving animals. He was a member of Nuffield Council of Bioethics, Ethics Committee, Board of Science and British Medical Association, and he was even involved as trustee in the Responsible Gaming Trust. And except having all this, he also published very regularly in Guardian as one of the prominent public intellectuals, which would Today, we would call them global intellectuals. So without further ado, Jonathan, thank you very much once more for accepting to give this lecture, and the floor is yours.
Well, thank you so much, Gazela and Petar, for that incredible introduction. And you know, it is traditional when people are given any award to say they don't deserve it. But in this case, it is true that I don't deserve it, that the level of my engagement is I'm not an activist on the street, I'm not behind the barricades, I'm an activist with a pen or pencil or word processor. But it's a real delight and privilege to receive that award, and also the honorary doctorate is an amazing privilege when it ultimately comes through. And it's just wonderful being in this company. I think I'm a member of the sort of extended family of the Institute and the region, and it's wonderful to see the familiar faces, and I so hope to be back in the region before very long. And I would have been there had I not have a commitment to be in the classroom on Monday. I thought it's just too much of a risk to come to anywhere outside the UK at the moment and maybe not be able to get back in time. But that was what was on my mind. So it's very interesting to be part of this conference, and also to have that paper, Method in Ethics and Public Policy, Applied and Engaged Philosophy, mentioned, because I should say that my preference is not really to talk about methodology, but just to do the work. The trouble is, everyone wants to talk about methodology and how to do the work. So I've found myself talking about methodology and writing about methodology because others have asked me to do that. And in the case of that paper, my friend Annabelle Lever, who unfortunately, well, she was going to talk at the conference today. Unfortunately, she's not able to, but Annabelle, with others, was editing a handbook in public policy, philosophy and public policy. And at the last minute, someone let her down on a chapter, and she was a chapter short. And she said, can you knock something off in a few weeks about methodology? So I just sat down and wrote, and more or less, not just one draft, but very quickly. And there is an advantage in writing things very quickly and not pondering over them for several years. You can just sort of free yourself in your thinking. And so I produced that paper. I'll come to it in a bit, and I'll talk about the content. I'll also talk a little bit about the methodology of work like that as well, and what it achieves, because in one way it's not at all an original piece of work, but it has allowed people to think about things using a vocabulary that they may not have put together before. So the talk I'm giving is called What is Engaged Political Philosophy? And it mixes things I've written about in the past with a project I'm thinking about now and just making early stages on it. So some of what I say today, this is a first outing for the material. And so I will be very interested in your reaction. A lot of it is not thought through. And so it's a very good time for me to hear reactions to what I say. So roughly speaking, the first third will be familiar to some of you, and then as I go on, it may be less familiar to you, at least from my mouth, although others may have said very similar things. I'm sure they have. So there's certainly a sense that we're going through a period in political philosophy where we're much more self-conscious about methodology than we have been in the past. I think when I started doing political philosophy, this was in the 1980s, no one talked about methodology. You just did it. And the way you did it was that someone came up with a theory, you came up with a counterexample to the theory, they changed their theory to deal with your counterexample, then you came up with another counterexample. Maybe you came up with a theory that resisted the counterexample, that someone else would come up with a counterexample to your theory, and this way the journals filled up. And so largely, not exclusively, the journals were full of papers that reacted to other papers in the journals. And everyone's agenda was set by one or two people. At the time I was writing, the agenda was set by Rawls and Nozick and then Dworkin. And pretty much everything we did was a response to that. And there was very little reflection on what we were doing, although in Rawls himself, there was already the distinction between ideal and non-ideal theory. For Rawls, that distinction was the same as a distinction between full and partial compliance theory. So the basic idea of the theory of justice was you set out principles of justice on the assumption that the vast majority of people would follow those principles of justice. So that's like setting out a criminal law, assuming everyone is going to follow the criminal law. You don't need police or prisons because everyone is obeying the law. But in the real world, we know that not everyone will obey the law, not everyone will act justly. So partial compliance theory is theory for when not everyone follows the principles of justice. And this is why Rawls talks about things like civil disobedience, because there are going to be times when our society is not just and we have to deal with that. But for Rawls in a theory of justice, these are relatively minor topics, important topics, but minor topics. And they come after having designed the correct theory of justice. And you see this in the terminology. Ideal theory is what we want. Non-ideal theory is parasitic on ideal theory. We do the ideal theory first, and then we do non-ideal theory because we're sometimes in circumstances where people are not following the theory. We have a different theory or a new theory to deal with those circumstances. That is one way in which the terms ideal and non-ideal theory are used. But I think that way is not prominent now in the literature, although it is still present. And I take a different approach to the distinction. There are probably half a dozen different ways of understanding it. But for me, I think of an ideal theorist as someone who has set out a theory of justice as a type of intellectual activity, thinking about what would be the most just society. And this is certainly how I was taught to do political philosophy. You think as hard as you can, use whatever resources you can to come up with a perfect theory of justice. In previous eras, this was known as utopian theory. We sort of lost the idea of utopian theory as some sort of wasted endeavor. This is what we were meant to be doing, coming up with a theory of justice. But if you look at some of the most powerful contributions, most inventive contributions to political philosophy in recent years and moral philosophy more broadly, what's very interesting about them is that they don't start with the concept of justice, but they start with the concept of injustice. So Miranda Fricker's book is not called Epistemic Justice, it's called Epistemic Injustice. Charles Mills, who we sadly lost last week or just a few days ago, talks about racial injustice. Everyone talking about race talks about racial injustice. And so if you look at Iris Marion Young, she has her 5 faces of oppression in Justice and Politics of Difference as framing her project. She doesn't give us a theory of the just society. She gives us accounts of injustice. Judith Sklar does something very similar. Stuart Hampshire also. So as you look back over the last 30, 40 years, post-Rawls philosophy, there's one current in which people are developing theories of justice. There's another current which seems to be much more inventive and interesting, where people are starting from the concept of injustice, not worrying about, not even raising the question of what a just society would be, because they are attending to the injustices in the world that are so evident around them: power differentials, exploitation, violence, manipulation, exclusion. So all these bad things in the world. So for me, non-ideal theory starts not with a conception of a just society, but with an account of the injustices that we face. And for that reason, I don't like the term non-ideal, partly because it seems you're already admitting to be doing something second-rate and parasitic by calling it non-ideal. So I prefer to use the term real-world philosophy, not necessarily theory, because I don't think all political philosophy is theory in any strong sense of theory. So I like to talk about real-world political philosophy. I've said many times, what I would love to do is relabel ideal theory as unreal political philosophy as a way of recapturing the rhetorical power. But no one seems to be prepared to accept that relabeling of their view. So we have a contrast between ideal theory and real world political philosophy. And I'm firmly in the real world camp. And that means attending to the problems, attending to the injustices you see in the world. Now, you may already be thinking, how can you identify injustices unless you already have a theory of justice? Don't we have to have a theory of justice in order to identify injustices? I think as a matter of phenomenology, we don't. I think if you take the example of exploitation, for my entire philosophical life, I've been working on exploitation. Since I was a second-year undergraduate, I think I wrote my first essay on exploitation. So I've been trying to define exploitation for almost 40 years now. I don't have a definition that I am satisfied with. I don't think anyone, unless you are a hardline Marxist, you probably don't have a good definition of exploitation. And even then, that will be a very specific form of exploitation that relates only to work. But everyone uses the concept of exploitation without having a theory of it. So that everyone is prepared to say, what I was expected to do in the workplace was exploitative. No one has a theory, or almost no one has a theory. So it seems to me it's rather like a native speaker of English with a sense of grammar for the language. We can all tell you when a sentence is ungrammatical. Almost no one can tell you what the rules are. And maybe this is one way in which people who have come to a language as a second language learner have an advantage over us. You know what the rules are. But if I want to know the rules of English grammar, I'd probably have to ask you rather than remember from my own education, because I was probably never taught them. You just imbibe them. But of course, in the case of grammar, there are rules there. I would say in the case of injustice, there might not even be the rules there. So we can all agree on certain cases of exploitation. We might differ about others, but we can use the concept without having a theory. Okay, so when I was thinking about ethics and public policy, I used a similar methodology, but in somewhat different terminology. Different areas have their different ways of thinking. And it's a different literature, but very similar things come into play. And I think I was inspired by a couple of things. So when I first started looking at medical ethics, I was incredibly disappointed with a lot of the papers I read. So there'd be a problem, something about end of life or beginning of life. And I'd go to the journals and I'd read a paper, and someone very often without much philosophical training would write a paper and it would say, well, here's our problem. This is what a Kantian would say. This is what an act utilitarian would say. This is what a raw utilitarian would say. Then a bit later on, you get, this is what a virtue theorist would say. And in conclusion, this is what a Kantian would say. This is what an act utilitarian would say. This is what a raw utilitarian. And so in other words, they would take a theory or take a problem, take a number of theories, work out what those theories would say about the problem, and then not know what to do after that. So the idea would be, well, if you're a utilitarian, this is what you should say. Or if you're a Kantian, this is what you should say. This is very crude. This is a caricature. Of course, you then get philosophers who say, I'm a Kantian, therefore, this is what I think about it. But when I started working on some of the committees that Gazella and Petar mentioned, the idea that I would give public policy advice by turning up and say, well, I'm a Kantian. Kantians believe this, therefore we should make a recommendation to the government that we should do blah, 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 because that's what Kantian philosophy says. Yeah, that would just be laughable, really. And yeah, occasionally, early on, I'd come up, I'd think about a problem, I'd come up with a solution, what I thought was a solution. I'd present it to a group, and they would say, well, yeah, that's very interesting, but who says that that's right? And this became tricky because you want to say, well, as we tell our students, it's not who says, it's, you know, what are the arguments? How good are the arguments? But I never actually did that because I know people would say, well, give me your arguments. And I realized the arguments were never very good. I mean, we kid ourselves in philosophy that we have arguments for positions. What we don't really. We have positions and then we grasp at arguments to try to defend them. And sometimes they work, sometimes they don't work. Normally they don't work. So we pretend that we have this. Of course, no, there are arguments for conclusions within a framework. So I'm not saying there are never arguments. The idea that there are arguments for the most fundamental things seems to me a sort of confidence trick that we play. So you get a bit frustrated with this. You know, people would say, yeah, I came up with what I thought was a great solution to something. People said, well, who says? And you want to say, well, you invited me onto the committee. Can't you just give way to my authority here? But of course, we also tell our students there are no arguments from authority in philosophy, that it has to be. So I thought this was just a very bad way of proceeding. And but I call that now the applied philosophy. Applied philosophy has a lot of different meanings, but the specific meaning I have is where you start with a theory and think you can solve the problems in the world by applying your theory. So you approach your problem, going back to Marlon Brand. So, for example, the philosopher Richard Hare defended utilitarianism, and then he wrote a whole series of books, I mean, maybe 4 or 5 books, solving every problem anyone could throw at him using utilitarianism. And in one of the books, one of the first books, he confronts this question. Well, what if you're not a utilitarian? What if people aren't a utilitarian? What if they don't share his theory? And his answer to that is, well, you ought to. And I've got another book explaining why you should. So please read my other book, and that will convince you to be a utilitarian. And then, you know, all the rest of this follows. Then, well, first of all, no one's got time to do that. Second, no one would understand it. And third, most philosophers disagree with it. And so the idea that somehow this is the way to deal with public policy by proving your theory first and then applying that theory to every policy area is, I call dogmatic. It's a sin of dogmatism. So the applied approach has a number of problems. So dogmatism is most obvious. What do you say to people who don't share your theory other than you ought to? There are many others. In some cases, many other problems. I just mentioned 2 other problems, although I've got half a dozen, we can talk more. And second is very often they just have implausible consequences. So it was mentioned that I was on a committee looking at the ethics of animal experiments. And this was an extraordinary time in my life because one of the very first meetings of the committee, the chair went around the table saying that she wanted to know the current state of knowledge in people's fields. You know, 15 people, most of them were scientists of some sort. So there were people talking about whether, you know, the latest research on whether fish feel pain. There were people who were talking about the recommendation sizes for cages for keeping chickens in. It was going around the table, and it was like one of those cartoons with the bomb coming around the table, the fuse coming around the table, coming around to me. And I thought, well, what am I going to say about the current state of knowledge on the ethics of animal experimentation? At that time, the 2 leading theories were Peter Singer, who said all animals were equal and therefore medical experiments are like doing the same thing on human beings, medical experiments on animals. And the other popular view at that time was Peter Carruthers, who seemed to take a view that animals had no rights at all and that we could pretty much do whatever. This is a caricature, but roughly saying you can do what you want. So the 2 philosophical views were, broadly speaking, you can do nothing to animals, or you could do anything to animals. And neither of those, of course, were at all plausible in the context. And hardly anyone writing about it had looked at what we were actually doing right now. So a lot of people were talking about experiments that were taking place in the 1960s and how bad they were. Well, they weren't happening anymore. We had much more subtle practices going on. And almost no one writing about the ethics of animal experimentation had even paid any attention to what was actually happening or what the regulations were. So this was very embarrassing. But luckily, we ran out of time. This is a common experience in my life. We run out of time before we have to speak. That's what happens when your name is at the end of the alphabet. Although maybe in Serbia, what counts as the end of the alphabet, it goes back a bit further for me. But so what I realized then is, if we approach things just with a theory, we will have problems. And we had a different type of problems when I started working on disability. Because what I found was that the concepts that we were debating disability in philosophy were just the wrong concepts as far as people in disability studies were concerned. So in disability studies, people were talking about the difference between the medical and the social model of disability. We only had a model of redistribution that we were talking about. We were talking about taxing some people and transferring money somewhere else. This had very little to do with actual social policy. So we didn't have the right concepts to engage with people who were really at the cutting edge. And I was shocked by this, because what I realized is that people in social studies of disability were actually philosophically much more sophisticated than we were in the area. We were taking concepts that had come out of political philosophy and trying to use them in the context of disability, rather than thinking really hard about disability and thinking about what are the appropriate concepts to be trying to capture this area with. So you can have the wrong concepts. So what is the alternative? Well, the alternative is to get very deeply engaged in the policy question. That is, rather than thinking, I've got a solution, I've got a theory that will solve all of your problems, just give me your problem. The first question is, why are people worrying about this right now? That is, if something has come to prominence, it is likely to be because there is more than one view in the public domain, and those views are likely to be backed by values, though it may well be that the people have not articulated those values very well, have not understood the subtleties, have not understood the debate as well as they could have been. But if you've got journalists involved, they're highly educated people, very sophisticated people. So the first thing we've got to do is, as philosophers, give up the first assumption that, one, we're the smartest people in the room. In fact, we have an even worse assumption than that very often. We have the assumption that not that we're the smartest, but we're the only smart people in the room. So what we've got to realize is people engaged in debates, civil servants, professionals of other sorts, journalists, are already philosophically sophisticated. And there's a debate going on in the public domain. And the first thing we need to do is understand that domain. So that means reading up. It means understanding the history of the problem. So one thing that I've seen over and over again, and this happens particularly in development for some reason, is that people come into the field from outside, see a problem, and propose an obvious solution to the problem. And it just seems to them everyone in the field is stupid because they haven't done the obvious thing. But very often, the obvious thing was the thing we used to do, and it didn't work. And we're doing what we're doing now because something else didn't work. So you see this in debates about sustainability. So of course, we want everything to be sustainable. Of course we do. But what does that mean in practice? In practice, it means a vast amount of delay, bureaucracy, and paperwork. If you want to make projects sustainable, you have to do audits, for example. So one generation wants sustainability. That creates a huge amount of bureaucracy. The next generation wants quick decision-making. So you get rid of the forms and then you lose everything about sustainability. So we just go through these policy cycles because we haven't understood enough about the history and how we've got to where we are. So I think this is really important. I discovered this in the first work I did on gambling. And a lot of people in the UK were opposed to the level of liberalization of gambling we had and wanted more restrictive social conditions on gambling. And at some points, I felt this may be reasonable. But then I looked at the history of gambling in the UK, and we had liberalized because we were unable to enforce stronger social restrictions. We found people breaking the law. So we liberalized because people were breaking the law. So we had this assumption you could bring in laws and people would obey them. Actually, that's not true. Very often it's not true. If people don't like the laws, they'll find ways of doing what they want to do, maybe with minimal compliance to the law. And so, but by understanding that certain regulations in the past just didn't bind, that meant that we would think about the problem in a different way. If you understand the subtleties of the problem and the history, also international comparisons. So think about what's going on in other countries, because most countries have the same problem and they've also been thinking about it. So there's a lot to learn from international comparison. This may seem absolutely obvious, but it's not done nearly enough. So in the American healthcare debate, for example, they're prepared to look at Canada and the UK. They don't look at Germany or Switzerland, partly because not enough people speak German, I suppose. But they don't look at other comparisons that could actually be a better model for how they could transform their own healthcare system. What they do is go to familiar comparisons rather than everything that's possible. Okay, so for my approach for thinking about these public policy problems, understand the policy dilemma, understand the current state of regulations, understand how we got there, understand what other countries do, understand the values engaged, and then you may realize that certain philosophical theories are going to be very relevant here, others not so much. So we can then draw on our training and discipline to start thinking about a range of options. So this is, in a way, the most difficult thing. You want to set out a range of policy options. Then you want to give reasons for why some are better than others. So some of them might be technical, some might be about cost effectiveness, but many will be about values. And this is when we start having a more philosophical discussion about which policies are supported by which values. And then we get to the very hard question that no one knows how to answer, which is, what do you do when the values conflict? So there are a number of tricks here. So there's something I did in the first edition of Ethics and Public Policy, which I didn't realize I was doing until I heard Daniel Weinstock talking about it, which is very often you can say that we disagree about values. We disagree about what's right and wrong in this case. Take the debate about abortion. So you could hardly get a deeper debate about values than about the permissibility of abortion, particularly abortion for non-medical reasons. But there's an argument that even some people who are opposed to abortion accept, which is a harm reduction argument. And the harm reduction argument says, imagine we have a policy of banning abortion. What's going to happen? Well, what we know happened in the past is that many women, particularly poorer women, will attempt methods of abortion which are very dangerous, backstreet abortions, and there will be a lot of harm. There'll be death and there'll be injury. So even if you're against abortion on philosophical grounds, you might think it's the best policy because it's a harm reduction policy. So there are many areas. Gambling, we do a similar thing. Around drugs, we do a similar thing. We say there's one thing we can all agree on: harm is a bad thing. Even if we've got different values, we can agree on harm reduction, and we can then maybe agree some sort of policy, not because we think morally it's the right thing, but because we think, given the flawed nature of human beings and how human beings will react to any policy, this is the one that is going to be least harmful all around. What Daniel Weinstock got me thinking about is whether this is a retreat from moral argument or really imposing a form of utilitarianism or maybe a form of liberalism on the argument, so that this type of harm reduction argument is much more congenial to people on the left than people on the right. So it feels like there's some sort of bias already in there. The arguments from the right are about outrage, about the breaking of things that are natural or encouraging bad behavior, laws that we can't allow laws that encourage bad behavior, even if they would reduce harm. So what I'm saying is these debates are fraught, and by their nature, they're very difficult, very hard to resolve. We can make small progress. We can look for compromises. We can look for harm reduction. We can look to show people that they can get what they want. And yeah, I'm inspired by possibly the most boring thing you could be inspired by, which is the way we regulate traffic. So if you think about car driving, when I started talking about this, about 3,500 people a year were dying in car accidents in the UK every year. I believe it's about 40,000 a year in the US. I don't know what it is in Serbia. I should have looked this up, but it will be in the high hundreds or thousands a year, people dying in car accidents. Now, if we didn't have cars and someone said, I've got this great convenient transport device, it's fantastic. Unfortunately, it's going to kill thousands of people every year, but it will get us to school faster, get us to work faster. We would say, well, we're not going to do that. We're not going to introduce a new form of convenience that's killing thousands of people a year. We're never going to do that. But that's not where we are. We're in a situation where we've already got it. And anyone who said we're going to ban driving because it causes too many deaths would just be laughed out of court. So what do we do instead? Well, what we do is say, well, it's too much to ban driving. But what do people want from driving? Well, they want to be able to get from one place to another in a relatively short time and relatively safely. So it's consistent with that to ban the most dangerous forms. So we don't allow people to drive very, very fast in built-up areas. We don't allow people to drive dangerous cars. We don't allow people to drive drunk. We don't allow 12-year-olds to drive cars. So we work out what are the most dangerous forms and eliminate those, and we keep the safer forms, even though they're not perfect. So what we do is say, well, we will work out ways in which most people can have most of what they want, even if the thrill of driving through the town centre at 70 miles an hour when drunk in a dangerous car is not available to you. So we ban some things because they're disproportionate. We try to keep others. So, and this is what we do a lot in social policy. We try to think, well, what are the most dangerous? We're not going to ban alcohol, but we might ban drinks over a certain strength in some countries. We're not going to ban all sorts of intoxicants, but we'll ban the ones that are the most dangerous. So we try to give people most of what they want, but just eliminate the disproportionately dangerous forms. This is what we do when things are already existing. And here's another point, which I think is absolutely critical when you're doing this sort of non-ideal or engaged philosophy, which is that our project is not about working out the best system. Our project is always about what changes can be justified from where we are. So we might say, in many areas, I mean, take drug regulation. If you were to come up with a rational system of drug regulation, I don't think any country on earth's current systems would be defensible. So in the UK, we have 3 schedules, A, B, and C. We have drugs that are less dangerous in the most serious category, drugs that are more dangerous in lower categories. Almost nothing is as dangerous as alcohol, but the alcohol isn't regulated in the same way. Nothing is as deadly as tobacco, but tobacco falls outside those regulations and comes in other ways. So if you were just trying to come up with a series of regulations around drugs, you would never come up with what we've got. And you probably would never have banned ecstasy or cannabis to start with, and probably not LSD either. If you just look at the harms, the known harms, rather than the what gets written about in the newspapers. But It's a wholly different matter to say we should therefore legalize all these drugs, because we have no idea what would happen if we legalize them. So one argument you hear is that if we legalize all drugs, that would get rid of drug crime. And in the United States, prisons are full of people who are in prison for drug crimes. So it sounds like, if we got rid of drugs, we would eliminate a vast amount of crime. Well, is that true? What we know is that if there are no drug crimes, no one would be found guilty of trafficking drugs, because that wouldn't be an offense anymore. But that wouldn't get rid of the people who were doing it. And so the people who were drug dealers, what are they going to be doing if they can't make any money out of dealing drugs? Are they going to go and work in McDonald's? Maybe they will. Maybe some of them will. Will they turn to other forms of even more violent crime? Maybe they will. Maybe they won't. Maybe if you can't make money out of drugs, then we'll have a new scourge of kidnapping or armed robbery. So we have no idea. We have literally no idea what would happen if we legalize drugs, because we don't know what the people who are relying on that income would do. Now, this is not a reason for saying we can't make any changes. Maybe we can make changes. Maybe we can make very big changes. But what I'm saying is the issue for us is not which is the best system. I mean, that is an issue. That is worth discussing, which is the best system. But what's in front of us is what will happen if we make the change from where we are to where we want to go. And that needs a different type of inquiry and different type of understanding than simple armchair reflection. So it needs to be a multidisciplinary approach where we think about many, many different factors. Okay, so this is the way of thinking about sort of engaged philosophy, but most of this has been around questions of public policy rather than the more traditional questions of political philosophy. I'm talking about some mid-level policy areas, the sorts of things governments have to deal with on a day-to-day basis, rather than the grander questions of political philosophy around the authority of the state or distributive justice more broadly. Can we make a similar distinction between what I call applied philosophy, where you start with a theory and apply it, and engage, where you start with the problems and work out what theoretical and other philosophical resources you can draw on? Well, part of, a lot of my work has been inspired one way or another by Amartya Sen. And he, in his book, Idea of Justice, really sort of kick-started me thinking about a lot of these issues. And he makes a distinction between two traditions. Early on in the preface, he makes a distinction which maybe maps onto an ideal, non-ideal, or ideal real world perspective in political philosophy. So, and of course, this is what one would expect. So I've already mentioned philosophers like Charles Mills or Judith Sklar or Miranda Fricker as people starting from injustice. So that for me is enough to make them real world theorists, if you start from the concept of injustice rather than justice. So you say, well, is this one way of making the distinction? Some people are interested in justice and coming up with theories of justice. They're ideal theorists. Other people are interested in the world around them and the problems they see and linking to social movements. That makes them engaged political philosophers or real world or non-ideal, depending on your terminology. So I went back to Sen when I was thinking about this talk because I hadn't remembered exactly who was on which list and why he'd put them there. And what he does is to say that there's one tradition which he calls transcendental institutionalism. So transcendental, for me, is the same as this idea of a perfect theory of justice. Some people who want to come up with a perfect theory of justice that transcends their particular society. It applies across all different societies. Maybe it needs to be adapted differently, but there's something transcendental at the core that applies to all. And institutionalism, it concentrates primarily on the institutions of society. And he puts in this camp Hobbes, Locke, Rousseau, and Kant from the tradition, and from the 20th century, Rawls, Dworkin, Gautier, and Nozick. So that's one tradition, a transcendental institutionalism. He contrasts it with people who are interested in comparative judgments. So instead of thinking what is perfect, thinking when a society is better than another society, without necessarily having an idea of what would be best. So the comparative judgment is just in terms of better and worse. And he says they're focused on social realization. So they're less interested in institutions, but more interested in what is actually happening in people's lives. On the one hand, you have perfect transcendental institutionalism. On the other hand, you have comparative social realization. And in this tradition, he puts Adam Smith, Condorcet, Bentham, Mary Wollstonecraft, Karl Marx, John Stuart Mill, and by implication, Amartya Sen himself is in that tradition of comparative social realizations. Now, the first thing that struck me was the first thinkers on the list, the first list, Hobbes, Locke, Rousseau, Kant, Rawls, Dworkin, not so much Gautier, Nozick. These were people I had studied as an undergraduate in a philosophy department. So that was my curriculum. The other group, Adam Smith, I hadn't studied. Condorcet, tiny little bit around democracy. Bentham, sort of you knew Bentham existed, but you never actually read any of his work. Wollstonecraft, we didn't. Marx was a special topic, but not on the general political philosophy paper. John Stuart Mill, of course, was someone we studied. So of the comparative social realization people, only Mill really made it onto the curriculum. Whereas if you studied in a political science department, you studied all of these people. You probably spent 1 week on each of them as you did your general survey, and other people like Payne and Burke and others as well. So there's something to this distinction, but it doesn't seem to be quite right, because the idea that Bentham wasn't interested in institutions feels quite wrong to me, that Bentham spent most of his time writing about institutions. But there is something here, I think, and but how deep is it? How important is it? I mean, what struck me thinking about these lists and going back to the applied and engaged approach is to think, well, of the great philosophers on the curriculum, what did they see themselves as doing? So this is a sort of Quentin Skinner approach. Instead of just looking at the text, you think, how did they conceive of their action? Were they just theorists? So, if you're a philosopher of time, you'd be thinking very hard about time and maybe responding to a literature. For most of the history of philosophy, there haven't been that many practical dilemmas about time. Maybe when you get to relativity theory, there are things that come up, but mostly it's an purely intellectual pursuit. So for the great political philosophers, were they like philosophers of time, just doing what they did as an intellectual pursuit, or did they conceive of their interventions in a different way? Now, it strikes me, and I haven't gone into really big detail about this in every case, but when you think about the great political philosophers, almost all of them seem to be responding to some political crisis in their own time, or a political movement, or a political problem, or even a revolution. So Hobbes, we know, was responding to the Civil War. Locke was responding to the end of feudalism and the battles between beginning of representation of the people versus feudal aristocracy. Rousseau, was again Marlon Brando, objecting to everything he saw around him. Kant, maybe we need to go into a bit more detail about what Kant was reacting against. But even these people who are transcendental institutionalists largely were dealing with political problems that they saw in their own lifetime. What makes them great political philosophers, it seems to me, is that they were both able to engage in problems that arose in a very specific context, but also leave something for others as a result of that engagement. So it's really interesting when you look at a debate that took place. Our great philosophers were part of that debate, but by no means the only people, and maybe not the most interesting people in terms of making a contribution to the debate that was happening in their lifetime. There may be other people who made a much more powerful contribution. But each of these people also produced ideas that transcended that particular context. So transcended, in some sense, not that they came up with a theory of justice, but they had something that they left for others. And so this is, I think, a frame that I'm, if ever I were to write a history of political philosophy, which I won't, but this is a frame for thinking about political philosophers. So one question is, what debate were they engaged with, or what you might say, what set their agenda? What was it that set the agenda of these particular philosophers? And then how do they deal with it? Was it a type of abstract reflection? Was it an engagement in practicalities, close to journalism, or was it something much more practical? So many philosophers will see a problem in the world. Hegel might be an example where there are problems, but his way of engaging was at a very high level of abstract reflection. There are others like Marx and Mill who engaged almost at the level of journalism. So they were finding ways almost on a day-to-day basis of getting their ideas into the public domain. But largely, not exclusively, it was still writing. It was writing for a different audience, but it was still writing. But then there are a small number of philosophers who have made an actual practical difference. They're philosophers partly because of their writing, but they have engaged with trying to influence policy in a very direct way. And here I would include Bentham. So Bentham was writing to kings. He was getting an audience with people in governments around the world. Gandhi is another example of someone who's both philosophical and activist. Martin Luther King is another. So you have those questions. What sets your agenda is the first question. Second, how do you deal with that agenda? And thirdly, as I've already said, what do you leave for others? What can other people make of your work? So what sorts of things can you do? All the thinkers that Sen mentions brought in new ways of thinking about things. But there are figures on the margins of the discipline, like Gandhi, like Martin Luther King, who were incredibly important in their own time. And we feel we ought to pay them great respect by bringing them into the curriculum. But they're harder to teach outside of their immediate context. That you have to struggle in a way to find things that you can apply generally. Now, of course, there are going to be areas that are very similar to the context in which they worked, where their concepts will use. But there's nothing like, say, the notion of the general will or the social contract or the state of nature and these theories. There are no grand concepts or theories, to my knowledge, in some of these more activist philosophers. It's quite interesting. The curriculum, it requires us to have teachable ideas. And what we often have done is take the teachable ideas from people who develop those ideas for a specific context. We abstract them from that context and use them quite generally as if it's a pure intellectual discipline now. And so if you think about what we do, of course, we're all minor figures. None of us are going to be more than a footnote to a footnote to a footnote. We're not going to be, there isn't going to be a chapter on any of us, I doubt, when the historians of the future come to write the history of political philosophy. But we can still, in the same way, think about what we're doing in this, I would say, dual, if we can bring it down to a dual focus. One is what sets your agenda, and the other is what do you leave for others? And because there will be people, many people who are just interested in the conceptual and intellectual side of things. And quite often what we leave for others is nothing very grand, but a new way of thinking about things. So I've mentioned Miranda Fricker's book, Epistemic Injustice, a couple of times. So I've been to conferences where people have said, well, this stuff was all known beforehand. The idea that women are not listened to in the same way that men are, or if you're Black, you'll be expected to give authority to others. No, this is all known. And of course, Miranda would be the first to admit it, that she didn't think she was doing something completely different to everything else. But what she did was name it. And once it's named, you can talk about it and you can discuss it and you can have a type of meta theory about it. Similarly with Kimberly Crenshaw and the concept of intersectionality. I know many texts that make the same points, but they didn't have that word. And without that word, it's much harder to talk about, it's much harder to notice. So quite often, people are coining a new term to name a concept and give us a shorthand for a way of thinking about the world, which is incredibly fruitful. So there's a whole lot of work in feminist theory about how things like sexual harassment were known about, but they were not named until the 1970s. Once we have these names, once we've got the intervention. So if you think about social contract theory, yes, of course, you can find it in Plato, but it's not given the prominence that allows us to think about the different varieties of it. And so a lot of the conceptual innovation isn't doing things that had never been thought about before, but it's bringing it to a level of consciousness where it can be discussed. So I've said, maybe this would be the last thing I'll say, but I've said, one of the things I coach everyone on now is that if you come up with a new view or a variation of a view and you're publishing it, it's critically important to give it a name, and preferably quite a catchy name. So if I look at the citations to my own work, I came up with this term shameful revelation in a paper. That gets quoted. Whenever that paper gets quoted, 90% of the citations are just to that phrase, shameful revelation. Or in the work I did with Avner Dishalit, we came up with the terms corrosive disadvantage and fertile functioning. So corrosive disadvantage, if that goes wrong for you, other things go wrong for you in your life. Fertile functioning, if that goes well for you, other things will go well for you. Now, we could hardly claim to be the first people to have noticed that this can happen. But we might have been among the first to give it a name, and it was a nice bouncy name that people could remember and quote. So they use that, and it's good because it's a type of shorthand. You don't have to go through the argument, that you're talking to a group of people who are aware of that. So I think this is the sort of thing we can do. We can focus and we can concentrate and we can aid discourse. Last thing I'm going to say, okay, because this really is the last thing I'm going to say. What does engagement mean? What does it mean to be an engaged political philosopher? So I'll leave you with a couple of lines that go back to my mentor, G.A. Cohen, or at least a discussion or critique of him. So Jerry Cohen produced an interpretation of Karl Marx's theory of history. Terrell Carver, in his book on Marx, is fairly critical of Cohen as a sort of definitive interpreter of Marx. And his point is that if Cohen is right about Marx's main contribution, it's very hard to see how Marx would have had the social impact he has had and the political impact. That is, if you're a technological determinist, that's hardly a sort of striking way of getting the workers' movement going. And Terrell, just in passing, when I talked to him about this, he'd forgotten he'd written this. But what he said is, how could Cohen's interpretation, one, attract an audience, two, unite a movement, and three, proceed to a goal? I just think this is a brilliant encapsulation of the three stages of engaged philosophy, if you're taking it all the way. First thing you have to do is attract an audience. Most of us fail miserably even at this point, right? Secondly, you need to unite a movement. Well, more likely you will contribute to the uniting of the movement that others are doing. And again, that is against our instinct as philosophers, because we're such individualists normally. We don't want to be part of anything. We want to be it. And we would rather be it on our own and ignored than part of a movement that belongs to someone else normally. But anyway, that's the second stage, that we need to unite a movement, and third, proceed to a goal. And that, of course, is something that very few of us, other than people like Bentham or Gandhi or Martin Luther King, have even attempted to do. It's probably well outside our skill set. But that gives, I think, quite a nice focus in the way of thinking. If you do want to do something, you have to do it with others rather than on your own. And you have to do it with others who have different skills and different backgrounds to you. Okay, so that's the end of the final lesson. And so thank you for your attention. I'll hand back now.
Thank you very much, Jonathan. Especially thank you very much for these closing works. I think they are very, very valuable and meaningful. You have to do it with the others. And one of the conferences, actually, which we organized several years ago, with Judith Butler, there was a name, important questions of life and philosophy today, but I will not spend any more time. We have, let's say, 15 minutes for questions and answers. So I see Hannah raised hands already, and I invite also others to raise their hands. Okay, Hannah.
Thank you, Joe. This was incredibly compelling. But what I wanted to ask you is whether you think that engaged political philosophy or real world political philosophy that deals with actual issues in the world, be it animal rights or abortion or whatever, might bring philosophy closer to people who are dissuaded by ideal theories and abstractions.
Sorry, I just missed one word there. Last bit, bring people closer to people who are initiated, did you say?
Who are dissuaded by abstractions and ideal theories.
Okay. So, my answer to every question is yes and no here. So, so that is what I thought. One of the things that has been on my mind, and part of the motivation for thinking about this, is that very often when I give a talk about non-ideal theory or the sort of engaged theory, I get the response from people that this seems to make philosophers redundant, because everything I say we can do can be done by good civil servants or other professionals or historians or something. And in the past, what I've always said is, fine, there's a difference in degree between what we do and what others do, but not a difference in kind. So that other people are doing philosophical work. But now, just in preparing this, I thought, well, no, that's not right, because when philosophers approach this, we are also looking for those general lessons. And the interesting thing is that it might actually give people an interest in ideal theory. That, I have had students who've started, I had a medical student who wanted to work on voluntary euthanasia. And then he realized he had to look at suicide. Then he realized he had to look at Hume on suicide. Then he had to look at Hume's epistemology. He ended up writing on Hume's epistemology, even though his interest was euthanasia, right? So some people will be attracted back into the more and more abstract. this way. But it's a matter of temperament, isn't it? There are going to be some people who are only interested in the practicalities, some people who are only interested in the ideal theory. And I suppose I'm talking really for an audience who are very interested in abstract. One thing that struck me, most of us started our work in political philosophy because we were interested in some injustice in the world. That you don't go into political philosophy for no reason. You do it because you're. But we get rewarded as political philosophers not because of our interest in the real world, but because of our intellectual ability, our abstract ability. So what gets you an A for your essay is seeing a three-way distinction where people only saw a two-way distinction. And so it's this sort of conceptual and abstract work that gets rewarded. So we get rewarded less and less for the practical. So we're sort of our head moves us in this abstract direction, but our heart is still in the problems. So I think what I'm trying to do is find that group of people who have both the head and the heart. And they're interested in practical problems, but they don't just want to be activists. They want to retain themselves as philosophers. And what is that happy medium? What is the way you can do both? So I think this is what I'm appealing to. I think this is what your question brings out. So thank you, Hannah.
Thank you.
Thanks a lot. We have 5 hands and I will close after these 5. So Snezhana, you are the first one.
Okay. I'll try to be brief. So thank you, Joe. I think that actually you succeeded to articulate in this idea of engaged philosophy many things that actually we try to do, and we always struggle with, the other philosophers debate about that. So this is the articulation, and I very much sympathize with your proposal, not only for the political philosophy, but also I think that it's also could be applied on the epistemology, on the other ethics, of course. But I actually have a kind of worries about that, because it's also my worries about that. The first is about the difference between the applied philosophy and engaged philosophy, because it seems to me, okay, you defined applied philosophy as a philosophy to try to apply the theory on the concrete problems, and engage is the different direction from the bottom up, from the problems, to try to consult, the theories trying to solving that. But it seems to me whether there is in practice, in some applied philosophies, I'm just wondering whether is the question of degree, but not, about, the substance, because it seems to me that if you say we do not need, to try to apply the ideal theory to the concrete problems, but we need to consult, the theory, from the bottom up, I'm just wondering whether it's question of, let us say, degree, and we can also do the good things, from the perspective of applied philosophy. And my other worry, the second worry, is about whether if we, insist on the difference between applied and engaged and stay, on the other side, whether we are still in the philosophy, So the question whether the engaged philosophy is real philosophy, what actually our the philosophers with whom we disagree, most usually critiques us, that we are not, we actually, the core of philosophy is conceptual analysis. You think, in the question of the exploitation, we know what exploitation is. It's not necessary that we build a theory around that. On the other side, the other element of philosophy is normative approach, So now it's not so normative, as probably kind of naturalistic, more natural, even, a radical approach, So the theory is not so important. Important is the real world problem. So I'm just have some worries about that, whether with engaged philosophy we actually have we can answer on that issues. Thank you.
Okay, thanks so much. I'm very sympathetic to what you say, and I overdrew the contrast. And I took sort of extreme cases rather than normal case. And one thing that I'm gratified by, I've given this talk, similar talks around the world now. And when I do it in a practical ethics conference, people say, well, we're already doing that. And I say, well, I'm not telling you to do anything new. I'm just giving you a way of thinking about what you're already doing, rather than, because I didn't make this up. I learned it from other people like Janet Radcliffe Richards, for example. But what I would say, and this is something I think that Iris Marion Young more or less says, which is there's a difference between starting from a theory and using a theory. And that is really what I want to get across. And that we will use patterns of conceptual analysis, we'll use theoretical elements, but we start with a problem, and then we find those patterns of theory and patterns of argument which are going to be relevant to the problem that's in front of us, rather than starting with a theoretical approach and assuming that that theory is going to solve the problem, whatever it is. So that I think is the difference. Now, I don't have, someone could say, no, look, I've got the right theory and my theory is going to solve everything. And Derek Parfit tried something like this at the end of his life. And I don't have an a priori argument that they're wrong. What I'm saying is that if they were going to do the sort of work I've been doing, this type of committee work, where you're trying to give advice to policymakers, you can't work like that. You've got to work in this much more pragmatic mode, where you draw on your background and training, conceptual analysis, but you don't allow that to dominate the discussion, because no one will listen to you if you do that, and you'll come up with elements that are not right. But I think a lot depends on what we mean by theory. And I take theory in a very strong sense, I think, of a theory is something ideally with a small number of variables and a small number of relationships, like utilitarianism, and you try to explain the world with this very simple formula. And as you can tell, I think that can help us think, but if we allow it to dominate our thinking, we're going to make a whole lot of errors. Okay.
Thank you. Elvio?
Thank you very much, Joe, for your really very interesting and inspiring talk. As usual, it's such an enormous pleasure to have the possibility to discuss with you today, with great nostalgia for the occasions when we met in presence and the hope for new occasions in a not distant future. I would like to ask an exegetical question, to call it this way, with regards to roles. My question is whether you think it's possible to think that there is a serious difference from the standpoint of engaged philosophy between the Old Testamental and the New Testamental roles, in the sense that political liberalism seems to be more responsive and more engaged with real life problems. I mean, the problem of the pluralism in society, and is also more careful about real world resources. I mean, it's not based, the argumentation favored that in political liberalism, which is the argumentation through the model of public reason, refers to what are the real resources of people, although the relevant people are qualified, and the resources that are in Rawls' focus are the resources of the reasonable person, but nonetheless are the resources that really could be engaged by real life persons, and that in Rawls' view are already present in the real world. I mean, are the resources that are part of the richness of political concepts of the tradition of constitutional democracies. So the question is whether we could establish a difference between the first and the second roles or stages of his thought, by saying that in fact political liberalism is much more in the direction of engaged philosophy. And very briefly another point, I would like to ask you whether you think that it is possible to qualify the philosopher as engaged philosopher a posteriori. I mean, the question is, real-world conditions vary. At some point, a political, philosophical construction can appear very abstract and referring to ideal justice, let's call this way, perfect justice, aspirational justice, as Dave Eslund call it. But at some point, there could appear conditions where the idea could be realized. Even ideas of racial equality, for example, in the past were utopian, but today they are part of the real world, although not perfectly realized, unfortunately. So is it possible to say that through time, we could come to see that, in fact, a political philosopher was engaged, although the times where he or she was writing was not a time favorable for the factual engagement with his or her ideas, but through time or even through generation, it could appear that he or she was a person who started a traditional thinking and acting, then had a strong impact on the real world. So,
yeah. Great. Much. Okay, brilliant. Thank you. Excellent point, Salvia, and lovely to see you as well. I'm hoping to be back in Rijeka before very long. So on the first point, so this is very nice, the idea that political liberalism is more engaged. And as you were saying that, I thought, yeah, this sounds right. But then it reminded me of the only time I have ever been able to ask Rawls a question in 1985, and the political, not metaphysical paper had just come out in Philosophy and Public Affairs. And he gave a talk, and he was talking about the overlapping consensus. I asked him how likely he thought it was we could achieve an overlapping consensus. And he said, not a chance, 1 in 1,000. And apparently a friend of mine in London, I was in the States that year, he'd given the same talk in London, and a friend, another graduate student, had asked him exactly the same question and got exactly the same answer from him. We found out afterwards. So that makes it sound much more like ideal theory, if he thinks that there's only a 1 in 1,000 chance of achieving it. Of course, that could be an exaggeration. But I think there are ways of interpreting rules where overlapping consensus is not so demanding. We might be able to achieve it. But there are definitely, you're right, definitely many more engaged elements in political liberalism than there are in a theory of justice. On the second point, could people be sort of retrospectively engaged? I suppose it depends on the definition. If engagement is about the intentions, but on the other hand, everyone writes in order to have some effect, I think, that even if you're not directly engaged in the debates. And so I think you're absolutely right. My two examples are Mary Wollstonecraft, whose ideas were not taken up maybe for 100 years or longer, and Robert Nozick, who was not sitting in policy units, as far as I know, but his ideas. I mean, when I was an undergraduate, everyone thought that he wasn't even doing philosophy, really. The ideas were so wild. And by the time I was teaching, half my undergraduates seemed to believe it. So the world had moved in that direction, not him alone. So I think this is quite often when I talk about the abstractness of political philosophy, I get the people saying, yes, but through our teaching or something, or through the long generations, maybe over the decades. And think, well, maybe some of us are lucky enough where we have that effect. So I definitely wouldn't rule it out. So yeah, so I think I'm agreeing with you, just giving some examples. Thank you.
Thank you. We're taking 15 more minutes since we are not going to have a final lecture this day. I think we have some more space to have all questions. Christoph, it's nice to put a face to a person who is sending emails these days.
Yeah. Hi, Gisela. Sorry about the emails. Hi, everybody. My name is Christoph Roy. I'm from Central European University, where I'm doing a postdoc fellowship at the moment. So thank you so much for this talk. It was really great. I really learned so much from it. Jonathan, you said something that I found really interesting. Naming is important. And I immediately picked up on that, and I tried to come up with a certain phrase or a certain slogan, and try to pack that into my question. So my question is about the phrase disengaged philosophy, in a sense, right? And in some ways, my question also relates to Elvia's question. So excuse me if that's if there's an overlapping consensus between our two questions here. My question is there any legitimation for the philosopher, for the political philosopher, not to do engaged philosophy in the way you explained it? So in other words, my question is there not a danger that political philosophy loses some of its critical edge when it comes too close to the public policy world?
Good. Okay, so brilliant, thank you. So I don't want to say that all political philosophy should follow the model that I've given. So I think there are at least three ways in which political philosophy is a valid activity. One is the engaged method that I've described. Second is where people are not directly engaged, but they're adding to the sort of stock of concepts and theories that maybe in the future, like Wollstonecraft, like Nozick, even if they're not directly engaged in policy, their ideas can be used. But I also think I genuinely do defend pure, ideal, abstract political philosophy. Because I think, to use my example of philosophy of time, if we pay people to work on the philosophy of time, why should we not pay people to work on analyzing the concept of the general will, even if they never think that's going to have any practical application? So I think there is that pure side to things. I'm mostly interested in the people who can do the pure work, but want to be doing more engaged work and thinking, how can we work together in a package to come up with something? But I don't want to say this is the only thing. But I would say it had been somewhat sidelined by the philosophical mainstream. Things have changed a lot. And so it's galling for me when I think of myself as a critic of the mainstream. Suddenly you become part of the mainstream. You think, well, I'm going to have to start criticizing my own position now because I'm not comfortable as being part of that mainstream. But certainly the gravity is shifting. But when I started doing this work, not on my own, with others, I think there was a concern about the pure abstraction of political philosophy. And our argument is just about challenging that monopoly rather than completely changing the way we do everything. Okay.
Thank you.
Thank you. Sasha, do you want to ask your question in person, or do you want me to read it? Okay, let me read it because I think it is interesting. I have a question about relation between...
I can hopefully ask it in person. I need some time to get over with this. Thank you. I read some of your work, and it was this was even better way to engage with your ideas. Now, one of the things that you mentioned about being engaged philosopher is creating an audience. And I'm wondering if you have a comment between creating an audience and using a particular type of discourse. You mentioned Marx, who wrote almost like in journalistic style. Now, some people like Hegel attracted an audience, even though they were very abstract and, as you mentioned yourself. And in our own time, we have people like Lacan or arguably Judith Butler in some of her, works that are deliberately, let's say, unreadable and deliberately complicated for their audience. So there is, I don't know, this attraction of audience or engagement or impact can sometimes be, accidental or unintended, or you know what I mean. So is there some comment from your side about this way of writing and creating an audience and so on?
Okay, so I think that's a brilliant observation, and Judith Butler is an excellent example. And every now and again, I try to read her work, and the most recently, I picked up a new edition of Gender Trouble, and I read the preface, And I thought, why did I ever think this was difficult? Because it's so easy. And then you get to the book and it's, for me, impossible to understand. Right? So she's capable of writing clearly, but for some reason she goes into this esoteric mode when she's doing, and other things she's done. She's written blogs. I understand the blogs, but that book seems to be written for the elect, and other people have probably had to translate it. But I'm glad you asked that question, because there's a bit of my notes I didn't get a chance to talk about, which was one of the dangers of having named something. So I've written a paper about structural injustice, which the term we really owe to Iris Marion Young for popularizing, although she's talking about things that are in Marx, probably in Hegel, probably in Augustine or something, but we now have this term structural injustice for what she is talking about. And having got something like that, I think it is potentially highly illuminating, but there are dangers with it too. And I thought of three dangers, there may be more. So one is a danger of distortion, that you now try to see everything through that concept, structural injustice. So things that really aren't become called structural injustice. Second is a type of laziness, so that once you've named it, you feel like you don't have to do any more analysis. You've given it the name, and that's all. But the third one, I think this is where we're getting closer, is a type of danger of condescension. That is, if people don't use the concept of structural injustice, you sort of treat them as unsophisticated or ideologically blind or something. So you have to think in our terminology, or you are not one of us. You're not part of the group. And I think this is what part of the danger around, not necessarily Butler, but some of the followers of Butler, which is, you think in our terms, which are very hard. You join the elect, and when you're there, you're allowed to dismiss everyone else without engaging with them, because you are part of the sophisticated group. Now, I'm not blaming Judith Butler for that, but her way of writing certainly encourages that. And a lot of more complex thinkers, people in the analytic tradition tend to label a lot of continental philosophers that way. I'm sure there are many people in the analytic tradition who do exactly the same sort of thing, having set out their conceptual terms and requiring everyone to think. And even Sen himself goes to the trouble of renaming almost every concept he uses. So you have to use his terminology to engage with him, rather than thinking about ways in which he's engaging with literature other people have started. So I think there is that sort of almost imperialistic side to it. But your main point was not this. Your main point was that it was this incredibly complex material that has attracted an audience, and how is that possible? So I think it's a really difficult case for me. I need to think about it. I don't know all of the history. I imagine it's gone through layers of simplification and simplification if it is to be attractive to others. But anyway, thank you. I just need to think more about these difficult cases.
Thank you, Professor Miščević. And we have one more question. So Jonathan, would you like to take this also?
Sure.
No more. Okay.
No, I take whatever you got. I'll take. But you keep time.
Okay.
Yes, thanks a lot. So I have a similar question like Snezana, but I will put it from a kind of first person, from autobiographical perspective, which is I started working on nationalism in the context, completely journalistic, politicized context. I didn't think of doing anything philosophical from it. It was really the time of nationalistic clashes in Yugoslavia, which ended in a war. And during all this time, I was writing political columns, basically against my own nationalism in my own part of Yugoslavia. So that was against Croatian nationalism and generally against nationalism. And I stayed with this. And then one day I met Ernst Gellner. and discussed things with him. And at one point, Kellner said, well, young gentleman, why don't you do something philosophical about the topic? And I started thinking about it, and I started philosophical work on it, which ended in 2 books. And then I continued thinking about this, and my latest manuscript is on cosmopolitanism. And it has all been provoked by concrete political things. It was absolutely engaged stuff in your sense. On the other hand, I started as being very, very leftist. Then I entered analytic philosophy. And then my big question was, okay, what would be the right leftist general theory? How could I think about justice that would satisfy my heart, but at the same time would be a good general conceptual analysis of justice? And I didn't write much about it. I still hope I will. I ended up somewhere close to, say, leftist reading of Rawls and then Habermas and so on. And I didn't see such a huge contrast between the 2 ways I was going from immediate nationalistic shits and then trying to develop a more abstract theory, or the other way around, starting from a very general question about what would be a politically correct conception of justice, and then going down, what would this mean for our society, and then maybe what would it mean for my country, and so on and so on. It's more like context of discovery and context of justification. Why do you see it? Why do you see it in such a dramatic contrast?
Very interesting, thank you. And yeah, I don't know that I have a huge amount to say here. I think there are going to be areas where what you described is absolutely right. But I think there are also areas where it's much less likely to be right. And I think disability is one where it was a shocking experience really for me that I was giving a talk about Dworkin on equality. And as far as I was concerned, Dworkin had the best theory of disability of any of the writers that I was reading. And it was a general concept of equality, but it just so happened there was a disability scholar in the room. And I briefly mentioned Dworkin's theory, and he was shocked by how reactionary and insensitive it seemed to the real concerns of people in the disability movement. And I didn't really know what to do, because what I wanted to say, no, you're mistaken. This is cutting edge left-wing political philosophy. It's as good as we've got. But as soon as he spoke, I realized it was, we were using the wrong language, insulting language. We just hadn't really paid attention. We had thought about disability from the point of view of thinking of me as a person in a wheelchair, say, rather than engaging with people. So it could be because these issues of nationalism were so already part of your experience, you had an instinct for what was going to be useful in philosophy and what was not going to be useful in philosophy. But you'd already done the engaged part before you started the abstract part. And so therefore you were able to use the right concepts and have the right match. But think of someone writing about nationalism who has only lived in a country without any national conflict, say, and tries to come up with a theory. As someone engaged in nationalist struggles in the former Yugoslavia, you would have no interest, I think, in the work of a philosopher who had no experience of national conflicts and had come up with a theory out of their own head. I mean, it might be useful, but it might be completely irrelevant. So I think you have been working from both ends. This is sort of Rawls in reflective equilibrium in a way, which in the rare cases it works is wonderful. I think I'm more interested in the cases where it doesn't work and how and how to deal with it. But I don't deny what you're saying. It's really interesting. And I'm working on nationalism now, which reminded me I must look at your work. So I'll be following up on that, Nenad. So thank you for the references.
Thanks.
Well, thank you very much. I think we ended with discussion at this point. Jonathan, thanks once more for joining us today. I'm once more sorry, and hopefully we are going to see you soon here in the region, whether in Rijeka or Belgrade, and also to award you this award, which is given to you this year, Miladin Životić. I'm inviting you all in for 15 minutes break. Then we should start at 11 with excellent presentation, actually, of two speakers, which you already heard during the question and answers. That's Hana Samardzija and Elio Baccarini, and also Alexandra Knežević, who is coming from our institute. So I invite you to join us at 11. Thank you very much.
Well, thanks so much, and thanks for the excellent questions. A lot to think about there. Thanks. See you shortly.